Welcome to the LinkUp before the ballot. The time is getting near to cast your vote. The pressure is on, and we are trying to do our part in informing you and bringing you the candidates to ask them the questions that you want to hear about. With us in studio today, finally, after a long road, he has made it. Party leader, Andre Ebanks of the TCCP. Welcome, my friend.
Don't make it sound like it was so long.
No, it wasn't long.
Chris is my friend.
It feels like a while.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
God bless you, and happy Easter to everyone who's listening. Caymanians, residents, and Caymanians overseas.
So you and I met back in when was that? It was like 2010.
That would have been about 2010.
2010, 2011.
2010, 2011, yeah.
Mr. Miller, bless him, brought us together to do the impossible endeavor of the one man, one vote.
Which I call one person, one vote.
One person, one vote. It's a little bit of a taboo topic these days.
I don't know.
Some people are just out. Every time I mention it, it's like they're casting stones at me.
I mean, think of it this way, right? Because remember when we first got, I won't say roped in, because we went voluntarily.
Yeah.
Because at the time, it was about, what was most important to us was the equality of votes.
Right.
There was such a large disparity between, say, North Side, East End, and then Georgetown, that it was kind of hard to argue why there's certain areas have 6 or 7 votes and then some have 1.
Right.
So I think what drew us as probably some of the younger members that got pulled into that group, if I think of all the names and faces that were around the table, was about the equality of votes. I think we were mixed in the group as to whether or not it should be single member constituencies, because you could have one person, one vote, and multi-member constituencies.
Right.
So that part was always a little bit that was in question, but it still went through, and there was a sense and a logic to it, because you're then be able to account for each member to a particular constituency, and it was about accountability. So
right.
It's not to say that there wasn't strong arguments for it.
Right.
I think if you're getting stones and darts now, it's about, okay, well, whether or not the single member constituency component itself is best.
I think a lot of people, I think their pain point with it is when they are in a constituency that doesn't have a lot of people running. And sometimes some people are like, well, I don't like what I have. I wish I had more options. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that's kind of people's pain point a lot. But I think hopefully in the future, I think one man, one vote, one person, one vote was the right step forward. But I think it can also evolve.
Well, that's the other thing, because the other I hear that pain point, and the other pain point I hear is people will say, okay, now Cayman has now $1 billion budget, 8 ministers. These are massive portfolios now. Right. It's no longer a slower paced island. This is now an international financial services center that has some global gravitas, where you have expanded government, complex portfolios. Is it correct? This is a question that's posed, and I'm sure other candidates have gotten this question. Is it correct that a massive ministry, pick one, health, education, might be
the easy one,
might be led by someone who got 200 votes?
Yes.
Should the whole country have a say in that? So the 2 pain points is the choice point, which is the one you raised, and then the direct selection of who actually is then controlling these massive or leading these massive ministries. But I still agree I think we're on the same page that it was still an advancement, in our view, of our democracy to take a step forward. This will need a 3rd cycle. It's in our manifesto, which I'm sure you read it, as whether or not it needs a revisit. And then that's how the country continues to move forward. You can't stay stagnant.
Well, it's the way forward, and we're sticking by it. So today I was at work, and my mother had called me, and she said, "I coming by, bring some sweet bananas and pawpaw for you."
I really don't like where this is going.
And well, neither did I, because I didn't tell my mother about this show for a long time. I just try to keep my life as like regular as possible and stuff. And of course, she ended up finding one of the episodes recently, and it was like, "Oh, I saw you on the TV. We have you up on the screen now," and yada yada. So she asked what she came by the bank and brought by the pawpaw and the niece berries and the sweet bananas. And she asked me what I'm going to be doing tonight. Well, I said, I got an interview to do. I'm interviewing Andre. She said, oh, Andre, you know, he used to work with me. And I was like, wait, so this was before law school? He said, yeah. And then he made the decision to go to law school. You know, I asked him, is this what you want to do? He said, yes, Miss Olivia, this is really, really where I want to go, the path I want to be on. So she said to tell you hello. And she looks forward to listening to this one.
Well, that wasn't as painful as I thought. We had some good times in the operations department. So I was as a quartet of us in a room.
Right.
This is now the stylist is open plan. This was open plan. It's my desk, her desk, the manager's desk, and another desk. And we used to have.
And this was on the building in Cardinal Avenue.
Correct.
Yes.
So not where RBC is currently located, the prior building. And we had some good times. It was like a family. It was.
So after Royal Bank, you then went to law school.
Yes. So, well, first of all, the first year of law school, I worked at RBC full time and went to law school full time.
Oh, okay.
I did both at the same time. So at the time, rest his soul, Harry Chisum. Bless his soul, I should say. Bless his soul. He said, you sure you're going to be able to handle both? And it was taxing because you had to work 9 to 5 during the day. And then you had to study at night. And he still gave me time off to do classes because the operations department that your mother and I are in wasn't client facing. So he wasn't saying,
I remember the area.
With the tellers. So you could leave because my role, ironically, was processing. One of the roles of the operations clerk was processing direct deposit payrolls. And ironically, one of the ones that was the biggest RBC account was government. So I was processing all of the civil servant payrolls at the time. And you used to get the phone call for whatever weekend the payment was supposed to drop. You didn't want to miss that.
Otherwise, it was going to be hell.
Cayman was small enough to be able to figure out who is the clerk that should have been posting this. People would call into the direct line itself. The money not there, right? So we had some good time. But it allowed me the flexibility to go out in the day to do classes,
right?
Study at night. But after doing that, which was an insane pace for the first year, I went and applied for law firm scholarship. And then I got with Hunter & Hunter, which is now Appleby.
Okay.
So then once I said, okay, it's definitely better to commit yourself to studying full-time. And then I relinquished the full-time role at RBC. But the first year was taxing, but I learned a lot from it. And I had a great time working at RBC.
All right. So let's fast forward a bit now. I wanted to ask you, since I guess you guys dissolved House, and when did the actual idea of forming the party come about?
Okay. One point before we leave
okay.
RBC that I want to say, the reason I mentioned Mr. Chisum is because he had the foresight to see that I wasn't going to be a banker. Not that I wasn't good in it. He knew it wasn't my life's passion.
Right.
So for him to recognize that in an employee and a young Caymanian and take the chance on me your work could slip if you're studying full-time, but to take the chance to ensure that a Caymanian was able to pursue their dream as long as you were able to get the work done at the same time. The reason I say bless him is because I wouldn't have been able to have completed that first year without him.
Let me tell you one story about Mr. Chisum, just to big him up and how real he was. After at Hurricane Ivan, my house was pretty badly damaged. Thankfully, we still had a roof, but there was flooding, a lot of roof damage, so there was leaking. But I was just happy to have walls and somewhere to sleep inside. Because on the drive home, 'cause I didn't stay at home during the hurricane, the drive home, all I saw were roofs everywhere. And I was like, just have a roof. I don't care what's in the house, just have a roof. That's all I wanted. But during, they were doing supply missions, RBC, I think Bahamas was sending down planes with stuff on them. Mr. Chisum and his son got on my roof to help put on tarp. That's what he was doing for his employees. And I will never forget that. He was a man of the people.
Correct. That's why I say bless him.
1,000%.
Because he
So
had that foresight to say, son, go ahead and do this.
yeah, man, he was definitely one of the good ones,
Mhm.
and wish there was more people like him in the industry.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Turning now back to your question.
yeah, so when did the idea start to manifest that that you knew that you did not want to run alone, but you wanted to form a group and get together?
So 31 October 2024 is
Okay,
when
down to the day.
when the four of us resigned. And I said in that press conference that we didn't resign as some sort of Machiavellian move to figure something out and how we were going to now join with someone else. We resigned and stood up on principle. And we can get into that, what that means later.
Yeah, I have it in the list there later.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
Of what we now mean by what is enough at the time. But in that interview, because this wasn't some sort of end run move to do some sort of political stunt or pre-election engineering, I said in that press conference we would take a hard look around and look at the various groupings, because by then it was all over the street who was going to be doing what. Take a hard look around, talk to folks, and see where four of us best fit. And entertained and had various conversations, all transparently between the four of us, and nothing quite fit. And at the same time, from the experience that the four of us had, we knew the value of teamwork and being part of a group, not only that you had a sense of their competence, but also trustworthiness. And so then we started to talk to a few more folks, Wayne Panton, M. DeCool, Ozzy had come along in the weeks that are after. And then before you knew it, it's like, okay, in order to do this, we could call ourselves a group, but really and truly, in the political sphere, it really is a party. And if we're going to do this, let's do it properly. Let's set up a proper constitution. So we looked at various examples throughout neighboring Caribbean regions of other political constitutions, and we saw, and we even I looked at the Labour Party in the UK, the Conservative Party. I think I even took a quick Google search of what I could find to say the Republicans and the Democrats. And what you found was the theme that we pulled from it, whether they're actually executing on that is another thing, but the theme that we pulled from it was that it should be a body that operates alongside the executive. So say the party is then successful and either leads or controls the government. What we saw happening in recent cycles is then the party sort of in the executive, the members who are there, part of the cabinet of the executive, seems to run along its own path, but the party isn't moving along with the executive. And then the proof is in the pudding, because for the last few cycles, you'll see the groups try to field candidates 6 months before the election.
Right.
Which is proof that the party hasn't been organic the entire time. It hasn't been moving the entire time. I remember being part of a party where you'd find out what the executive was doing in a newspaper with everybody else. So we thought, if we're really going to do this, let's put together a full-on constitution with different councils. The first one was launched as the Youth Council. And ensure that it's a body that is grassroots up and is taking its own life of its own and working in concert with the executive. So creating executive branches, creating bespoke councils with specific issues, and having that be infused in the policy work and the challenges that the executive is going to do, and then have succession planning to be able to have the foresight to identify who's going to be the next candidate. So you're not running around 6 months before the next election. Because I'm not afraid to tell you in the audience, I don't want to do this forever. There's going to come a time where my ideas are going to be the stale ideas, to use a more politically correct jargon. And my son could look at me, let's make something up. It could be flying cars. And I could be like, we're not going to regulate flying cars. That's crazy. And he'd be like, but this is the move. Everybody's got to do this. My time will come. So you'll need to then bring up the next generation who can see the ideas. Because now I can talk to certain people and talk about AI and you can see eyes glaze over. But it's real. It's happening. Blockchain is happening. we've got to position the country to be able to be a part of that workforce and adapt to it. So that my time will come. And I don't want to do this forever. I have a certain set of goals, and the party has a certain set of goals in our era to overcome and move the country forward. Then somebody should take my place. And then I'm the one who's behind the desk saying, my day, we wouldn't have done that. Well, we would now do this, and let the next group take over. So we wanted something that was going to last the test of time, work alongside the executive, and be more grassroots. And that's how it came about. And we said, well, if that's our vision, and we didn't quite see anything that quite fit that, why don't we just do our own thing?
So
kind of like starting a business.
So when the idea of the party came together, how was the nomination process for you to become leader? Because a little joke, we share a common hater. I'm not going to mention the name, but I saw a little clip of him saying, well, Andre, he's just masquerading around as a leader. He's a fake leader. And he's had some things to say about our show as well, but it's all good. But, for those who might believe that, here's an opportunity to say what the process was around you becoming the actual leader of the party.
So we did a lot of work. This was all prior to Christmas, well, just before Christmas, through the Christmas season and into January, of working on the Constitution, which is a point I just left off. Once we formed it of how the Constitution would be shaped, had it ready, before we would launch it and then go to the elections office to file it, we then gathered what we termed under the Constitution the founding members, which are primarily made up of a body of people who were closest to us, either politically or friends and family that believed in the cause and the vision we set out. So we said, let's gather all of them. There was near to 40. And before they do or support anything, let's set out what we're trying to achieve and why we're forming this. Pretty much what I just told you in the last question. And if they buy into that and say, this is what the country needs, we will then move resolutions to, one, create the party. So they'd be the founders to sign it. So then it gives it life. And then two, to nominate the leader. So we set out the vision, what the 20 objectives were that are in the Constitution. And there was a large applause that this is the direction the country should go in. And this is the direction that a political party should move in. Once we had that, a moment that I'll never forget, the next resolution to move was leader. And the person who moved that resolution was G. Wayne Panton. And he said it was sort of, in his mind, a passing of the torch. Because remember, I would have been a senior policy advisor in the 2013 administration when he was then the Minister for Financial Services. So been on the road together. We assembled and he helped pass reams of legislation for financial services in that term, foundation companies, limited liability companies, limited liability partnerships, changes to the Companies Act. We did a raft of legislation together. Just went on a complete tear for the industry. So I know the man. Coming forward now, and he hadn't had the experience that he had as premier, I think he knew now, okay, it's time now to move the country forward, move it into a new era. And he gave a compassionate, heartfelt, inspiring speech. And it was the honor of my life for a group of intelligent Caymanians to agree, clap, and approve the resolution. And there go, I was the party leader.
So you brought up the Youth Council. Unfortunately, Ms. Tibbetts couldn't join us today for some, had to tend to an emergency. I hope all is well. I wanted to congratulate her on the post, and I can't imagine stepping away from one of her passions. Aviation was an easy choice, but I wanted, since she's not here, could you explain what the role of the chair of the Youth Council is?
So first of all, yes, apologies on behalf of Lily because she would have been here.
Yeah.
She left me a message that she had to attend to something quite urgently, but knowing her and her character, she'd have been here if she could. And I told her to go attend to what she needed to attend to. So this came out of, after we've drafted this Constitution, let's make sure that we are standing by what we put in there. So it's not just a document that's in there. We put this provision in and we got this, but nothing's actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a bunch of policy-specific areas that you could touch on. You could do one for older persons. You could do one, say, women. That was one that we thought. But ultimately, with that thought in mind that we don't want to do this forever, so then we're doing this for somebody, some people. And so that would be the generation and generations that are going to be behind us. So let's start off with youth. And I also had reflected on the fact that in my capacity as the innovation minister, we had a talk that was a combination of a few entities that brought will.i.am down. I think it was either 2023. I think it was 2023.
Oh, that was for the Cayman Bay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he gave a talk at the Marriott. And it
He's
stayed
big
with
into
me.
tech.
Yeah, so he's into tech. And so the purpose of that gathering was that it was an innovation connection. It was about tech. Then Cayman Finance was there. A few other bodies were there. So he was down at Cayman Bay, but then he also gave a talk at the Marriott in the ballroom. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, have your policymakers, remember now I'm sitting there as the Minister for Innovation. So it's like, here we go. Here comes the dart thrown at you, the stone thrown at you. Have your policymakers ever reached out to the youth and asked them, how would you solve X, Y, and Z problem? Because you'd be surprised that they might actually have the answer or be on the road to the answer. Because ultimately, this is what you're leaving it for. So that quip from him stayed with me. So bringing it back now, looking at the Constitution, thinking about what other help are we going to need, and thinking about that we're doing this for the generations behind us. Firstly, let's start with the Youth Council and ask them, and ask Leanne, what would you change? And in her case, as you say, to make already headlines, to be a woman pilot is big. And somebody could look at her and say, why would you leave that? But she had a burning desire that she wants to help move her country forward in a positive way. Can she do that in some sort of way and be a role model as a woman pilot? Sure. But she, I think, wanted to have more tangible, direct impact, positive impact on policy. And to our pleasant surprise, she said yes. And she asked probing questions like, is this basically some kind of cosmetic job that you just hear, but then there's no real influence? And I said, no, it's your show. The Youth Council has its own constitution. As long as it doesn't wildly depart from the party, it has its own constitution. Your job is to act autonomously and advise us, because the future vision of this is, should we win the government, is that you all will be coming to caucus at least quarterly to challenge ideas, advocate for ideas, vet ideas and policies and proposals, bring your own proposals to the table. And then the proof is in the pudding. Once we launched it, we could see that it filled a void. I mean, it took off in a way that I didn't expect initially. So it touched a nerve. And then in addition to that, the manifesto. We had a target for it to be out by, say, near March, because we weren't trying to play chicken with anybody. Whenever it was done and we felt comfortable and it was a document we could stand by, we were going to release it no matter who had released theirs or not yet. And just around, we had a target around mid-March, late March. We gave it to the Youth Council, and then they came back with a whole bunch of comments that this is missing, that is missing, this is missing. And at first, some people were like, oh, we're going to miss our target to get it out. But at the same time, on the other hand, the flip side of that coin is, but that's what they're there for. They're there to spot things that wouldn't come naturally to us, that are going to be on the forefront of their mind.
And you incorporated those.
And then we incorporated, and now they have their own section in the manifesto. So the theory works, is my point. They spotted things, they pressed things, they expanded things that only they can see. You don't know the one. What's the saying? The one who feels it knows it.
Right. Absolutely.
So you're not going to feel everything that they feel. And then the last council meeting, so the manifesto got done, that went out, and then the last meeting that we had was Saturday Gone at Morgan's Restaurant. And again, they planned it, and they did sort of I guess another term that I could use, sort of a speed dating thing, where they broke up the candidates and shuffled you around, and we asked them questions. And then they also were posed current challenges to give in their feedback of what we should do about it. And in the
So that's direct engagement.
that's direct engagement. And in that questions that we asked the youth, you got some profound stories, things that they're dealing with on a daily basis in terms of bullying, sexual harassment, how traffic impacts their lives in a real way, mental health. And sometimes you think like maybe what I had to deal with in high school I thought was a big deal at the time, but I'm not sure how I would cope with some of the stuff I hear that they're dealing with now that I didn't have. Social media wasn't around when I was in high school. And I would have thought the internet was a big deal and things that go out on the internet, but now that's nothing compared to how fast something can move on social media. And it can be false and completely rip a hole through someone's reputation, and then whoops, that wasn't true.
Well, I think you as a politician know about that.
Whoops, that wasn't true. So they're dealing with a range and magnitude of issues that we didn't face. And then likewise, my dad would say the same thing to me. The things you faced, I didn't face. Mm-hmm. So there's their value.
I wanted to say big up to Miss Tibbetts' mama, Miss Ruby. We are a big fan of the cakes on the show. Whew. We've had them numerous times here.
I call them calorie grenades.
I made a critical mistake today by not ordering these ahead of time. So the next time that you come to sit in the chair, I am going to have a 12-pack right here.
Go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
So the elephant in the room, because I would get killed if I don't ask this question, but you've obviously answered this numerous times. But we do have a bit of a younger audience who may not be in tune to all the different mediums out there. You mentioned that when October 31st, you guys broke away from the UPM government. It was yourself, Miss Heather Bodden, Miss Sabrina Turner, and
Kathy,
Miss Kathy Ebanks Wilkes. I always say Wilkes, but I need to Ebanks Wilkes, get it right. You guys decided to break away from the government. There was a lot of backlash for that in the community. I think a lot of people didn't understand fundamentally that it is constitutionally provisioned for that if you are in disagreement with what is proposed, your only option is to agree or resign, right? I forget which section of the Constitution that is, but I was trying to look for it quickly and write it down, but I knew that that's pretty much how it read. So what led up to that? And ultimately, how did that decision get made? Because it obviously was not a light one to make.
It was extremely heavy to make. Probably one of the most challenging decisions of my professional life and anything that I've ever done. And I don't want to speak for the other three, but I'm sure it would have ranked right up there for them too. Because let's just take my portfolios, for example, that I was responsible for at the time. This is a massive decision. Financial services and commerce. Financial services, the country's top economic pillar by a mile. Commerce, crucially important for local business. The second ministry, investment, innovation, social development. Major initiatives we're trying to get to the finish line. For innovation, it was to try to get to the final, more public test phase for the national EID. Social development, we had a goal to reform all of the key pieces of social development legislation, some of which haven't been touched in decades. Financial Assistance Act got done in 2022. And then the last one, which took 2 years of policy work to provide enhancements to the Older Persons Act, provide enhancements to the Children Act, adoptions that were taking on average years to complete, to move that in line with international standards, to have it more streamlined so you can join families quicker. All of that body of work that started with ministry policy work, initial research and analysis, public consultation, drafting of bills was all now coming to a culmination of a head in the final 6 months of the administration, or at least by the end of 2024. Because I had a goal of myself to complete all of that by 2024 so that 2025 could then be focused on what you want to do next. So why would I want to leave all that if it was just some simple argument over maybe a clause in a bill somewhere that I didn't like, or a particular project that I thought that there was splitting hairs over, and then take my ball and go home? Why would I leave that massive body of work and responsibility if it was just going to be something to take very lightly, something frivolous? What the short answer is, we left because we have professional ethics that we weren't willing to breach, and we wanted to stand up for the country and protect it for certain things that we saw. That's the short answer. The longer term answer is there was a successive number of events. There wasn't just one. It was a successive number of events where good governance guardrails were coming off. This now is an executive run amok as a getting to a runaway train. Somebody had to pull the emergency brake. When you look at the allocation of just what's in the budget, because we approved $50 million for a school, thinking that what's in your budget, you don't necessarily have to spend all of it. It is there for you to try to do as much as you can, as prudently and as wisely as you can, not to spend all of it. And then when you get a report that comes sort of at the last minute that you don't really get a time to read, some of these business case reports are this thick, coming in at the last minute at the end of a caucus meeting, and having to try to flip through that and understand that this could go over 50.
Is that just does that arrive in that fashion just because that's the nature of the beast, or is that kind of done on purpose?
I think that there's probably a bit of both that can happen. So you have that, and again, as we said at the Seafarers Hall after we resigned, I think that was the 13th, 14th of November.
That was the public meeting.
That was the public meeting to explain this same question. No one's saying that the BRAC shouldn't get an upgraded facility, educational facility. We went there as caucus members and saw it. But does it have to be to that much? Can we conserve? There's much more we can do with that capital. And we can have other facilities or other projects that the country needs.
So these were conversations you were having around
why can't we rethink this? Do we have to go this far? And
the idea was that whoever was pushing for that wanted it.
And the majority, as it should, majority has its way. So that's one thing. Then you have this, what I call a strange obsession with making heavy amendments to the National Conservation Act, which was to, in my view, and in those of us who departed view, take away pretty compelling environmental protections out of that act. So let's put this into reality. You're looking right now as a topic that's on the campaign trail of beach erosion. That comes about because environmental safeguards, which were known at the time, were ignored to be able to facilitate hotel or development business. And it was said at the time, because the Department of Environment said at the time, we need a certain set of setback here, can have beach erosion, this could get to a crisis point. Fast forward nearly approximately 20 years later, we're watching it happen. So watching that
the Conservation Board actually said that
back in the day
that
this is a danger.
If we move forward,
this is a danger.
We can face erosion.
This is a danger.
And planning went ahead.
And business went ahead. So taking that example, and we're seeing now the result of that, we're now going to try to strip away more protections. Who else knows what will happen? So we are all talking about the pace of development, of overdevelopment. We all know we need development, but there's a balance to be struck here. One of the proposals was to have cabinet override certain things, like an EIA. Those are the scientific experts. I don't want a project that can come through I make a decision along with other colleagues to not do an environmental impact assessment.
These amendments would have allowed developers to ignore the EIA requirement?
For something that was deemed a government project or cabinet approved project,
So,
not even
so
government.
the cabinet could just approve something,
Could just approve something.
and then go ahead and
So
clear.
let's not throw anybody else under the bus. Let's take me.
Okay.
I believe West Bay will need a public high school, an educational facility in the near term. So someone says, "Well, look, this new law has changed. If we do an EIA, this might not happen in your next term because those things are very slow. It's not just about the scientists; it's about the social impact. It's everything. Those things are very, very long. There's a nice piece of land; it should be fine. If you can get the other colleagues to agree." Then we can get forward and get this done within your term. That's the temptation that could kick in. I don't want that because let's just say it gets built. There's something wrong with the land. There's something wrong with it, and it created a turmoil. I want the EIA report because that's what I'm going to have as my insurance policy to say this was vetted. It went to the proper channels. The relevant experts across the spectrum have looked at this and said this is safe to do. If there's a way that process needs to be expedited, fine. But I don't want the elected arm to be able to do that because I think that's a conflict between, one, the executive power, which is in the Constitution, and whether or not protection of the environment, which is also in the Constitution. The balance is already there. So I don't necessarily want to move that. There are other provisions that I could go on and on with, but that wasn't it. The main pain point in that scenario was that the bill that was being drafted was not emanating from the environmental ministry, which is called the sustainability ministry. Draft and instructions were not issued. So to take a step back for your audience, in order for any regulation or legislation law to be amended, the practical realities of it, cabinet must approve what they call draft and instructions. So that means every minister around the table knows what's happening, have agreed that, say, the Companies Act needs to be amended or the Banks and Trust Companies Act needs to be amended. The relevant ministry works with legal drafting, and then a bill comes back to cabinet for checking and vetting before it's published. In this example of starting the amendments on the National Conservation Act, that didn't happen. So you get to caucus, and a big thick set of documents is presented that this bill is going to be amended. But there haven't been any cabinet-approved drafting instructions yet. So who authorized this? The relevant ministry is the environmental ministry, the sustainable ministry. They're now getting this. So the policy expertise for government rests in that ministry. So think about it this way. I'm the financial services minister. Let's say the minister for health has their team draft a bill to amend the Companies Act, and I don't know about it. SEMA doesn't know about it because they fall under me. They haven't seen it yet. Of course, this is out of order. This is irregular. The bill has to come out from the government team that has the policy and expertise, or at least know about it and be included in the drafting. When that step didn't occur, it's like, look, we're now going into irregular activities here. That means this could be a free-for-all. Anybody can start tinkering with anybody's laws. We're supposed to be one coherent team. After that, there was back and forth. But at the end of the day, when the Minister for Sustainability, which is Kathy, said, I can't sign off on this. The environmental minister can't erode the environmental law, the primary legislation. Okay, fine. Well, then we'll give it to the Minister for Labor's team to pass. This is wild stuff. On what basis are we going to explain to the country that the Minister for Labor is bringing the primary piece of environmental legislation for amendment, and the environmental minister is saying no? What's happening here? This is maybe other countries, but this is not proper governance that the Cayman Islands is used to. On top of that, you then have a struggle to then have a referendum. What needed to have occurred is that the tourism minister sit down and set out what is the vision for tourism from 2 years back, from 2022. 2021 and leading up to part of 2022 would have been difficult because the country hadn't reopened, and all of us, to give credit where credit is due, had to focus on how to reopen the country because there wasn't a plan when we took it over in cabinet. But coming out of that and the borders reopened, set out and do the policy work of a vision of where you want tourism to go. You want to more focus on stayover. If it's cruise, what type of cruise? So that by the time you're at least done with the administration, you should be waving around a plan. We are going to focus on cruise. Maybe we're going to do more high-end cruise. This is where we're projected to put some sort of facility. This is roughly how much we think it will cost. This is roughly where it should be, and we've done the environmental initial preliminary assessments, and this is how it should fit in the budget. So that way, even if you feel that you need to get a steer from the country referendum, people are reading a referendum with a plan. They can decide whether they like it or not. But none of that work was done.
So it was just an idea.
It's just an idea. So without that, what I would call proper policy work being done, and there was ample time to do it, the only deliverable is what I think is a deficient referendum question. And I remember saying this. I said this in the debate in the bill, and it's happening now. What's going to happen is that you're going to plunge the community into tension during an election campaign where you'll have those stakeholders who are affected by it who genuinely believe that they need some other economic activity in their industry of cruise because the numbers are declining. So the feeling is real. So they're going to grasp for this and fight for this. On the other hand, because the proper policy research hasn't been done, those who are passionate about the environment are going to come with equal force to say no, and others are going to say yes. And then you'll have a grouping in the middle of the country that this isn't their day-to-day issue. So without something to sink their mind into to make a decision, it's almost as going to be a deficient referendum. And then worse, because it is non-binding because it's a government referendum, but still there'll be a political steer of it. So if it returns as no, what does the next tourism minister do? Because the same stakeholders from the same stakeholders of the cruise operators are still going to say, yes, but we need help. But I'm sorry, the country has said no. You're putting that minister in almost an untenable position from the start of the administration. Let's peel this back. Let's not put it there yet because there's not enough homework done yet. Again, I see that as something that is just putting the country in danger and an unnecessary acrimony. And then on top of that, you had wasteful spending going on where you had a disproportionate set of allocations and budget items going to items that don't really need to cost that much. And we have real problems. We need to get affordable housing online, and we're doing these vanity projects. And if that's not enough, we then had this arrangement, which I talked about in the 13 November Seafarers meeting, whereby Minister Kathy, as a sustainability minister, takes on, as instructed by caucus and cabinet, a very brave decision to admit that the regen project is too expensive, goes to Parliament, sets that out, that we have to step away from this. It's too expensive. Every model that came from Treasury when finance team, government public finance team, Treasury came and did all the financial modeling, it's not affordable in its current state. That was signed by the prior administration. So this administration didn't sign that. The prior administration signed it. Every model said it's not affordable. So we have to make a decision here. We can't sit like this. The country's wanting to know what's happening with this because it's a disaster in terms of what's happening with waste management. Makes the brave decision as backed by caucus and cabinet, goes to the country, say we're going to break away. The vendor that was selected will pay their setup cost in cash and we'll leave this. And then we'll have to then retender, scale it down and do something that's affordable for the country. That's done. You get into a caucus meeting months later and then find out that while I was traveling at the time, I think the premier was traveling at the time, and come to find out that two ministers, unbeknownst to the rest of caucus, have gone back to the vendor to say there's a possibility we don't pay this in cash. We do this with land swaps.
Oh, I remember that. That was it? Is it true that Barcus was on the table?
On the table. So
instead of paying the cash, they would just give Barcus away in substitute of
or do some set of land swaps. But I don't know the full extent of the conversation. I just know it was land swaps and Barcus was involved. Now, maybe
so as a West Bayer, that must have been triggering.
of course it triggered. So there's two issues there. One is, it is okay for a government, a cabinet, even a board of directors to change its mind, to come back and say, look, maybe for X, Y, Z reasons, we looked at the financials, this might be a better way to do this. But that decision has to come from the group first to say, okay, because this is a big thing. This has been announced to the country. This is what everybody thinks that the country's going forward with. We relooked at this. Any minister or a couple of ministers come back and say, you know what, let's revisit this. This is kind of what we're thinking. And then authorize two members to say, all right, let's form a working group or whatever to then re-engage the vendor to see if this might be better, if we can prove it will actually be value for money. But that didn't occur. It's almost as if the vendor then was given the impression that this will be the new direction without the rest of us being involved. That was the problem that we had. So when you take all those examples that I said in terms of wasteful spending, nonsensical things that are wasting the country's time and throwing it into acrimony, irregular activity in terms of producing legislation that could be harmful to the country, the choice that you face then now is not some little frivolous squabble. These are things that could actually bring harm to the country or waste the country's money. You have a choice of whether or not you're going to stand up on principle, because your first job is MP. I could almost somewhat grudgingly accept the quitter argument if you left Parliament. But you cannot be a minister unless you're an MP first. So that has to be your first duty as a member of Parliament. How do we best defend the country? If by the Constitution of Collective Responsibility and the cabinet manual that's in place, you are duty bound if the majority approves something in cabinet, you're duty bound to the public and in Parliament to follow that majority. You cannot fight. So a few people have said, well, why didn't you continue to fight? You cannot fight. You are duty bound and locked and handcuffed to that decision. So, and you've seen Parliament where there's a roll call of when a particular item is coming and you go down the line and who voted aye singly. So you can see the camera's on you. At that point, what goes through your mind is that you have constituents and you have a duty who are going to say, Andre, you should have known better. How could you let this occur? And you're now going to hide behind the fact that you're bound by collective responsibility. You have a duty to stand up for the country, pull the emergency brake, and let folks know what is happening, so that you have an opportunity to change roles on the field and become part of the opposition. To say, this is not acceptable. This can't stand. So if your audience is more of a youthful audience, the point that gets me about this is I'm in the public arena, people are going to throw darts, things are going to be said. I have to live with that. That's part of the job on any day of the week. But on this point, what message are we sending to our young persons that if you stand up on principle, if you see deep-rooted issues that could harm the country, and you are duty-bound, in my opinion, to stand up, and that is then chastised and made fun of, then what message does it send to our young people? That you're not supposed to call things out? You're supposed to just go along to get along and take the bigger paycheck? You're to take the bigger prestige when you know something is wrong, or at least could be very wrong for the country? I think it sends a dangerous message to say, because of chastising and bullying, it's just better to just stay away, not call things out. That's not good governance. Good governance is standing up on principle and saying, for these reasons, I can't see that this is good for the country. This is not only harmful to the country, but I think breaches good governance and breaches certain ethics. And I'm going to stand up for it. and make sure that this close to an election, the country then gets a chance at a fresh start. It can make up its mind of the kind of individuals it will want in the administration and in Parliament. And let that be the deciding factor. But not groupthink that is doing things unchallenged without real debate because there's a certain set of interests that they're trying to satisfy. That is not acceptable. And the message we should be sending to our young people is if you believe in good governance in this country, if you don't want the status quo to continue, and that's where enough is enough comes from. Because we've seen it for cycle after cycle. You'll look and see a decision and be like, that doesn't make sense. Why would they go along with that? It's not good. It wasn't good enough for the four of us to just say, because of the stigma that could be attached to us, because we would like the trappings of power to continue, that we'll just go along to get along. No. Right. It was do what's right for the country and let the chips fall where they may.
So you've brought up so many points that I want to touch on during the course of explaining why you decided to part ways. The first thing is after, I think it was January or February, where they kind of gutted the National Conservation Council and appointed new members. First, what are your thoughts on that before I ask my actual question?
The thought was, okay, so by that point they had withdrawn the bill that we had deep difficulties with.
Right. Because they didn't have support.
Right. Which, again, to anyone who says you weren't doing your job, that was part of doing the job. Because legislation that we held a view was harmful to the country was prevented. So we were still working. I suppose that was probably their way of downshifting if they wanted particular outcomes or a new audience for the NCC. There are really good, solid Caymanians on there. So I don't have any difficulties if you take names and faces out of it with the people that are there. But I suppose the question that was raised, and ultimately this is why I think a freeze was put on the court, is whether the language of the composition of the council, which was relevant technical expertise, which is the real sort of scientific, I think it's relevant technical and scientific expertise.
And you had some of that expertise on there.
There prior, and they were also Caymanians. Do these members fit that particular criteria? So they may be overall competent patriot Caymanians, but that legislation has a particular legal requirement, and has that been satisfied? And I think at the moment where it stands, at least best to my recollection, the judge at least said there's something to answer here. So let's pause on this and see what happens.
So more to come.
More to come.
You brought up that there was spending that was a little bit out of control, I think is how we could phrase it. And there was a report that came out recently stating that the country is facing a deficit of $20-some million, and we are about to lose 40% of our cash reserves possibly in the next year or going on to 24 months. One, how did we arrive at that? And then two, if you are elected not only into government but become premier, how do you go about fixing that?
So part of it would have been that when the budget was initially composed, and this happens cycle after cycle, and it's something that needs to be fixed, would have been that there would have been allocations that historically will go over what's in the allocated budget. So the most probably famous of them is NGS 55, which is about the indigent healthcare. So historically that goes over budget because it's expensive. And what happens is a number is put there, but anyone who's working with our government can tell you that number will be insufficient, but you're trying to keep it in a reasonable way because you're also trying to fit other priorities into the budget. So there are allocations like that where it's thought, well, if you need to apply to Parliament for additional funding for something as essential as that, you're probably going to get it. So that's one that you may know you might underfund, but you know if you apply for funds, you can't really say no to essential healthcare. So some of those would have now probably run over the budget, which is why if you know that, and if you know revenues aren't growing as the way that they could, you would want to curtail the spending because you know some of these other essential services will probably need more supplementary funding along the way. So you had that. But that wouldn't account for what was almost an $80 million swing. Once after we departed, there was additional spending that I think was outlined by either the Compass and or CNS that had the cabinet reports of some of the spending that went to other items that may be good in theory, whether it was charitable organizations or foundations or churches that might be good in theory. But can that really be spent right now? And there were other uplifts in the budget where I believe it was a minority government trying to prove it was still viable, trying to show before the elections it's a good government with these uplift in areas and grants in other areas. But really and truly, the country really can't afford that. So this is where you'll have a government, which now leads into your question. If the Caymanian Community Party is leading the government, you'll have to make hard calls and tighten your belt and say, those things might be good, but we can't afford that right now. In addition to that, what's in the manifesto is that we need to move to what is called outcome-based budgeting. So right now the system is set up that the budget is, think of it as a pie. It historically has had the same slices. And within the slice, sometimes people don't eat their entire slice. But it's a use it or lose it system. So you might continue to eat it all even though you don't need it all because you want to get the same slice, same size of slice the next time.
Because they're scared if they don't use it,
they won't get the same slice.
Yes.
But really, what is the outcome that's produced? So if there's a particular outcome that has said that this is what we're trying to achieve by 2026 or 2027, and that's done, then really that's the budget that you get, rather than this use it or lose it system. So that's part of what I think needs to be reshaped. But also, no matter what accounting system that you put in place,
making things a bit more efficient.
They're more efficient. But no matter what, ultimately, no matter what accounting system is put in place, a government still has to not consider what is going to be a political win in a particular constituency or a particular set of stakeholders. If really and truly you can't afford it, you have to stick to your priorities. And where this now has become urgent is because maybe at the time of the spending, it wasn't necessarily maybe foreseeable that you'd end up in a global trade war, which will increase the global price of goods around the world, which will then have a knock-on effect in Cayman and make things more expensive here. So then the tools that you would use to help the local populace with managing cost of living can now be outstripped, because you don't have as much cash on hand to be able to have maybe additional financial assistance, maybe stipends, reduced duties on cost of goods, because that's also revenue. You're now in a more precarious position. So even if, because I've heard some comments about, well, some of this stuff comes to caucus and you would have known there, or it was in the budget before. Right. There's a difference between an allocation being in the budget, like your household, and there's a difference between that and what you actually spend. So my wife and I could give it a household example, might say we want to go to pick some place. We want to go to Denver, Colorado for summer vacation, just making stuff up. That's in the budget. We've already budgeted for the summer, that's it. If something happens and we realize that there was an injury with a child or some sort of car accident, you can't still go to Denver. Would it have felt good? Would it have felt nice? And is that a good thing to do for family vacation? Yes, but you can't afford it. So you're going to have to make tougher calls that may not be popular, but are better for the overall health of the country's finances.
So how do we go about moving forward after this now with capital expenditure projects? Because there's obviously some very, very critical projects that need to get done. East-west arterial, something has to be done about the dump, potential port or at least cargo facility. Do you have, I mean, obviously you're not in government, but if you are, you can't predict everything, but do you have kind of ideas of what needs to take priority?
So I was mentioning this in another interview. First, you got to establish when you're there how much money is actually available, because there's a number of projects you just named that you want to get to, but what can you actually afford to do? Mm-hmm. Which then makes going back to the referendum question for a cruise facility even more tricky, because now if the country's now seen this report and say, wait a second, I may have said yes, but I'm not sure what the cost of this will be, and I don't want it necessarily.
Especially given tariffs now.
And given tariffs now, I don't necessarily want to give the next government a blank check because there are no details with this question. I might pull back. I might have been for it, but I might have to pull back now because the country might not be able to afford it. So first thing is stabilize the finances and see what you can actually afford. And because, let me make this point, because some of the financial rules that we've agreed with the UK may be breached, even if there were projects, whether it be a airport expansion or a cruise facility, could be done by way of coming into some sort of financing arrangement with another party where you might defer the government revenue and pay that back later. The UK might look around and say, well, hang on a second, because you're out of line with these rules, I might not approve an arrangement like that. So it's not so easy to say, well, you could do maybe something without direct cash initially, but that still means that you're diverting government revenue. So the UK might say, well, you may not be allowed to do that because you don't have enough coming in. Mm. So first step is stabilize the finances. 2, look then with what you can afford and what's most urgent. So you've touched on a couple of them. We do have to retender and rescale a waste management facility that's fit for purpose within the country because it's an environmental and health hazard. Got to get to that. Got to complete the east-west arterial. So find out where exactly you stand, tighten your belt, look at the most crucial projects that you can do within the budget. And then also, there are also some creative revenue measures that could be introduced. So say, for example, in my time of my travels in, say, financial services, or before you even get to that, I'll show you how all these issues are tied and how they can help each other.
All right.
So for example, let's take the issue of immigration reform. There are certain fees in there that are now too low. Maybe they were okay when they were originally implemented, but they're now too low. And with the sophistication of some individuals that are actually coming to the country, some of them have told me in my travels as minister, I really should be paying more in terms of independent means for permanent residency, because that may have been okay whenever it was put in 8-10 years ago. But now, because the island, because of its success in financial services, is attracting high net worth individuals, I should be paying more. Or maybe you have what some people have said, a fee that's more comparable to what they're making, and then remove other things like being able to purchase property in order to get PR points. So there's other fee categories where you could generate revenue and have a higher level of individual that can come here, and you can use those funds to either help with paying for government projects or park it into, say, a social development or education fund, which might then be able to help young Caymanians who may be slightly off the mark in terms of the qualifications or the experience for a role, but then that fund helps pay for the additional training that they may need so that they can take on the jobs. So I think that there's ways in which you can boost revenue. Another one that I got in my travels as financial services minister, and say, rather than the current fee structure for all the different entities, banks, trust companies that have that set fee, now because we're servicing clients in Asia who are in a different time zone, they're like, for certain transactions, these are major transactions that are being processed through Cayman Islands Registry. If you added an additional resource or two in say, company's registry, we would pay a super express fee as long as the person could produce it. Mm-hmm. Same result, so you're not giving anybody an advantage that they wouldn't have. Same result they would ordinarily have, but they get it faster. So rather than trying to increase the existing fees, create like a super express fee. So if it's a merger of two companies, Cayman companies in Asia, but they know that these are big like private equity companies where some fees are like a rounding error. Like they might say like they pay $5,000 for a certificate. Give it to them, make sure they get it on the day, same answer that they ordinarily would have gotten, but they're getting it faster. And then you can have these express fees come in to help pay for other things.
So, thank you for that answer. The cruise port, do we really feel, based on, I don't, obviously that wasn't your ministry, but based on being in there and what information that you have been privy to and your knowledge, is cruise ship numbers are declining. Do you feel that building the pier will actually be beneficial in increasing the numbers?
So there's two schools of thought there, right? It'll depend on how much it's going to cost the country, where it's going to go, and is it going to be sensitive and have a balance with the environment. So those questions, to my mind, have not been answered in a suitable way to make a decision, which is my problem with the referendum and our party's main problem with the referendum. But I do think that it is beneficial to have a diverse tourism product. Cruise tourism means a lot, but means a lot to particular operators in West Bay. They've grown up on the water, they know the sea, they're passionate about cruise tourism, and realistically, it's good not to have all of your eggs in one basket. So is there a way in which we can look at it where you present a sort of a balance between the two opposing views, so that this doesn't sound like pie in the sky to your listeners? There was a meeting that I was involved in early on before the referendum was set. It was contemplated, but it wasn't set. And I was still in government. I was still in cabinet, where you had those who were, say, proponents of crews that were making their case. But there was also a meeting with the same CPR group now. Mm-hmm. And I think there was a recognition at that meeting for them that something does need to be done. That subsector of tourism, cruise tourism, does need to generate economic activity. Where they have a disagreement with, fundamentally, is where and how much is it environmentally sensitive. So that's why I think those questions need to be answered. And you may be able to forge consensus to move the country forward, rather than what's happening now is that it's a vexing issue. In addition to that, and that's in the manifesto, I also think if you take a step back, you can have a redesigned tourism season. So at the moment, for time immemorial, I think
I remember this the year round.
The year round. So for time immemorial, it's been the same cycle. U.S. Thanksgiving goes around to Christmas. January drops off. Spring breakers come in March. It goes down again. Then it comes up a bit in the summer, and then it's flat again until U.S. Thanksgiving.
Really flat too. Some restaurants close down altogether.
But that isn't to knock what was there before, because that's how the economic activity was happening in the country. You were following the pattern. Step forward into 2025, where there's a whole other set of reasons for visitation in the country, because that's what tourism is, right? It's visitation. You now have, by virtue of all the international rules of OECD, FATF, of having to have real economic substance on the island. That means that there are more businesses here who will then have their offices visit here, their shareholders meetings here, conferences that have to be held here. So I think if you had a greater joining of tourism and financial services, you could end up with a much more even tourism season. Because at the end of the day, those operators are looking for economic activity. And as long as that economic activity is coming in a way that the country can manage, is beneficial to the country, I think that then uplifts their industry and maybe helps to solve the problem in a way that they hadn't foreseen. Also, there's other visitation that's happening. We can start to expand into heritage visitation, heritage tourism. You can start to expand in ecotourism, which is why folks are quite passionate about Barcas, because the ecological value of Barcas is off the chains. So if you can resolve that and create a national park there with more ecotourism, that's a whole other type of visitor to come here. Mm. So I think that the tourism product has real room for advancement that can be economically beneficial for the country and match other industries. So we're working in complement rather than working in conflict.
Okay, thank you. You recently were on the Leaders Debate, and I guess congratulations on making history there. It was the first of its kind. There were some notable aspects about the debate that you were making some very pointed remarks towards the progressives. What is it that you feel about the progressives that is a clear delineation between them and your party?
So part of the issue is, for full disclosure, because prior to becoming a civil servant, I was part of the progressives.
Mm-hmm.
So a few concerns were how, before all this, before politics, was what we talked about when we saw and started the Caymanian Community Party, is not having that aspect of the party being its own living, breathing organism and body that's traveling along with the executive. There was a disconnect there. And again, to replay the recording, there you go, the proof is in the pudding. You just try to get as many candidates you can before the election because the party hasn't really grown and expanded its brand. But beyond that, in the context of this election, I find it stunning that some of the tax and spend folks and some of the folks that we had the most difficulty with, who the progressives know there are difficulties with, would accept those individuals into their party. And for the sake of what I think is probably for the sake of getting numbers to have an expanded and large party for the purposes of the election, I find that stunning because it would seem to go against the grain of items that they have been espousing for years, of items that they say that they're known for in terms of good governance, fiscal prudence. You would have seen to have adopted now individuals that run afoul of that. That to my mind can't be reconciled. Doesn't make sense. So I find that now incompatible with the Caymanian Community Party because you're, in a nutshell, to say it simply, you're no longer who I thought you were. Maybe you can change, maybe you can adapt, but as you are currently composed, you have evidence to me that you are not who I thought you were.
So I guess the natural question now is that if you don't have all 10 members elected, and depending how the situation is, do you have any idea of who you would be willing to work with to form a cabinet and a government?
So to make a very clear declarative statement, I hear all the crystal ball gazing and each group will only get 4 or 5. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Nobody absolutely knows. We had informed this party to be part of some other combination. We formed this party because we wanted to go flat out and show the country a new approach, a mix of experience as well as fresh ideas, and go flat out to try to win the government. Again, this wasn't some pre-election engineering. Having said that, the question you're asking is a hypothetical, like, Andre, I hear you wouldn't have done that. This is a genuine party that's trying to win the government. But hypothetically, what happens if you fall short? Mm. To my mind, it's a process of elimination. If you identify the individuals or the groups that you can see are just not compatible, maybe nice people for you to go have a cup of tea with, have a cup of coffee with, but in terms of running the country, because this isn't personal. I hear a lot of personal things happening out there, and I'm trying to steer our party away from that. Take names and faces out of it.
We all have friends that we all have friends. A bear with, but we wouldn't do business with.
Exactly. So
Don't we know
you,
that?
you and I might be close, but would we enter into a landlord and tenant arrangement? I don't know, right? Right. So take names and faces out of it.
Okay.
Based on what I've seen so far and your approach to certain things, and now how you're currently composed, you're not compatible. So then that leaves either looking at the block of independence, and there are folks in there that I think could do a good job, and still I think some manifestos have come out. I think the National Party's manifestos come out quite recently.
Mm-hmm.
You look to see whether or not who do you have the most broad alignment with on policy, and crucially, because this is one of the takeaways from the 2021 administration, who do you think you can best collaborate with?
Yeah.
So,
and I think you've learned a bit about that in your PACT experience.
I think the term is almost 4 years. I think I have a degree in compatibility, right? If there is such a thing, right? So the short answer to your question is process of elimination. Once the country sees the 19 that it's there, particularly if you have a transparent party or individual that's put out their manifesto, you can read it, you can see it. That's what they should be held to account to the public with.
Right.
May not get all of it done in 4 years, but we know where you want to go. We know what you believe in. See who best align, who is going to be effective, and who is going to be compatible to move the country forward. Because the point that I try to make is, I can't say that the 2021 administration was a complete train wreck because there were wins. To give credit where credit is due, some of the legislation that I talked about that had been passed, getting off of international lists, also took passing legislation. I can't do that by myself.
Reopening the country.
Can't do that by myself. So there were other wins that the whole cabinet came behind. There was vision. So some good things did happen. What I think was missing was not just the harmony and some of the tumultuousness came out on the public display, which is most unfortunate. But beyond that point, it's more so the fact that, yes, there may have been individual ministers that may have set out a strategy and a plan and got things done. But without that cohesiveness as a team and all the ministers pulling in the same directions, some of the larger transformative things that the country is due for did not happen because you didn't have that cohesion. And that's what's missing. So my pitch to folks is, if you have that cohesion, you have competence, and you have trustworthiness, believe you me, from somebody who was able to keep head down when you realize that this wasn't the steadiest ship, but keep a head down on your portfolio and get that amount of work done. Imagine if you have all 8 ministers and the parliamentary secretaries pulling in the same direction. Honestly, you can move mountains within one term.
So let's, I guess, dive into your manifesto, which came out, funny enough, at the leaders' debate same night. You were accused of not having one, and then you dropped the bomb. Go to our website, download it now. So I have some points. Let's dive into here a bit there. Cost of living. I can't touch on everything in there, but I've done my best to try to pick some points from most of the topics there. And then at the end, there's a couple of questions from the public that I would like to ask. So cost of living. How do you envision the use of transitional fuels helping the people in the Cayman Islands?
Okay. So there was a moment in, I think, early 2024, it's my own personal experience, where I was starting to look ahead at the 2025 election. And I remember looking at my latest CUC bill with my wife and going, I can barely explain this, right? So I can see a Chamber of Commerce debate question come in. How do you explain your CUC bill?
Yeah.
I can't explain mine, right? I'm not saying it's rocket science, but I can't explain mine. So I sent a WhatsApp to the CEO of CUC and said, can we have a lunch and learn so you could just break this down as if I'm a 5-year-old? How does the bill actually work? It was a refreshing conversation, and then I had a replay of it because I think CUC offered to give a tutorial of how and it made sense
and it felt fair to you.
I'm coming back to it. So there was a replay, I think, where most of the political groupings, I think, were at least offered. I can't say who went. Caymanian Community Party went and had the same tutorial, which was pretty much almost a rehash of what I asked for individually a year ago. And they made 2 key points. One is, They suggest that for at least 2, maybe 3 administrations, they have been asking for a requirement in the building code to build homes efficiently with foam and installation as a requirement. And it has never been passed. They suspect that the reason that it hasn't been passed is because it might throw off the numbers in a development package of how much a home might cost. But their counter argument, which is a good one, is, but that additional amount that might bump up your mortgage a little bit pales in comparison to these huge bills that you're getting hit with every month, particularly in the hottest months. So the government should step in and make it mandatory within the building code to have efficiency building in. That will knock off the price right away. And they could show how they had examples of employees that had more efficient homes than mine, and say, well, I have foam around certain places, but not all of it, and show how the bill would be lower just because you're insulating, particularly the AC, which is the biggest draw. Second point that they made was, yes, the country does need to move to utility scale solar. But for a number of procedural and other reasons, it's going to take some years. And the country needs a win because this is expensive. We live here too. This is them talking. So you see, we live here too. We don't necessarily want to pay these bills either. And we don't want to be the bad guy. You think you get darts thrown at you as an MP? Think about the darts that get thrown to CUC.
Yeah.
But there is a cleaner fuel called liquid natural gas. Not 100% clean, admittedly, but cleaner and less expensive. And we can bring it in without a huge capital expense that would get passed on to the consumer. It can relatively go through the same pipes, get that in quicker, reduce the bill, while we do all the other items that we need to do to ramp up to utility scale solar. So I said, so that still has a cost, but they believe that cost will be less than diesel, which is a big part of the fuel factor in your bill, and bring your cost down while you're doing the environmentally safe and future process to get to utility scale solar. We live under the Caribbean sun. That should be the primary source of energy.
Speaking of the
Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
1,000%. Speaking of electricity bill, you said you wanted to have a better understanding of the calculation of the fuel duty itself. Was that presentation a part of that?
It was.
Okay. Because I know that it's been brought up in cabinet before, and people have never really been able to explain it when they were there.
I ended up saying it didn't really matter because their argument on a temporary interim move to LNG, which was cheaper, you didn't really have to wrap your mind around that calculation. If you can go to a more inexpensive source for a limited time period, then put that to the side. Let's move to that source. That's why it's called a transitional fuel, and then ramp up to utility scale solar, which then overall will bring the bill down substantially.
Okay.
And then for those homeowners that may be, say, financial assistance clients, the government may need to step in to help them insulate their homes because they wouldn't be able to afford it.
Okay. All right. Let's transition into immigration. It's oh boy, immigration is one of them. Not even just in our election, but friends up north too. But well, I don't know if they're friends anymore. But what issues do you see with the temporary work permits?
It's currently being used, for lack of a better term, as a loophole. Its primary purpose is I think the theory behind it is if there was a non-Caymanian that is the one that's available for the job after everybody else, the Caymanians have been vetted. And that is objectively the person who would get the job. But for whatever reason, the business needs that person sooner. You'd expedite it by getting them a temporary work permit because this is the person. But I think what's happening is because the length of time to process the full permit is so long, the businesses are jumping to the temporary work permit to get the person on and then move them to the full. And so then for the Caymanian, where the process really hasn't been, in a number of cases, fulfilled, how do I know that this is the person,
right,
the non-Caymanian, who ought to have gotten the job? So that needs rectification. But the wider question of immigration, I think, is ripe for opportunity. and opportunities for Cayman, can create opportunities for Caymanians. So I talked about this maybe in the leaders debate, but I know I talked about it in the West Bay South Forum. At the moment, I think most reasonable, honest people will say the system isn't really working for anybody. And worse, for a number of the businesses that have now gone global, and COVID has taught them remote working,
Right.
some of the entry-level jobs aren't in Cayman. So forget about the temporary work permit. The job might not even be here.
Right.
It could be in Canada, it could be in India. So how do you incentivize those businesses to bring the jobs home? Because you want the economic activity of the job. So the example that I've given that I've seen in West Bay, not just West Bay South, but West Bay, I've had someone come to the constituency office and say, bro, I pretty much fit the bill of this job. Like, I did everything the country told me. I studied, I came out, I got work experience. And then I'll call the business and they'll say, well, yeah, that person is a perfect match for the university leaver job. But that job's not here. So that next job is just that slight next up the chain, up the ladder that they probably could fit, but not as strongly as somebody else. So we need to incentivize the businesses to bring those jobs back home because we want that economic activity because you want the Caymanian to be able to stay here. Because otherwise, in my travels of financial services, you're seeing Caymanians say, well, I'll just stay over here. I can just stay in Singapore.
You're hearing story after story after story about the Caymanians just not coming back home, staying overseas for the jobs, or leaving with their family to go overseas.
So, and I've seen it firsthand with us. Like, Andre, cause sometimes on some of those trips, you'll go find the Caymanian young professionals that are out there, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's New York or London, and say like, are you going to come home, my sister, my brother? You going to come home? Why? I've got the job that meets my qualifications here. I've got the life. I'm young. I got the life that I want to live in London or New York. There's no incentive to go home. I can't get onto the property ladder. Why would I come home? So you have to incentivize the businesses to bring the jobs home. So we need to make the system faster, but you also have to mine the data. So this is where innovation comes in. If I could bore you for a second.
Yeah.
What I was alluding to in the leaders debate, and also I think the West Bay South Forum, is the government, I think, is sitting on a treasure trove of data to help solve this issue. If you have Education Secretariat, you have the portfolio of the Civil Service, and you have the Department of Work, your Education Secretariat should be able to see all the Caymanians and all that they're studying and what they're coming out of school for. Portfolio of the Civil Service has all the civil service jobs that are coming online. And Work is a treasure trove of data of the work permits that the private sector are asking for, which just, to my mind, and I've talked to some folks in tech companies, just to be able to have an app that aligns that data of who's studying what. There should be a sort of an assembly line of Caymanians that are matching these jobs. And then go back to my earlier example, because not everybody goes away to have a master's in AI. We need to have TVET and other vocational skills, which have to come online fast track because of AI, because they're insulated from AI at the moment. Plumbing, technicians, mechanics, have that social development from those extra fees that I was talking about, where you uplift the fees on, say, PR, to uplift the Caymanians so they can meet the job. So even if the work permit is issued for a time, everybody should know the rules of the road, that Sally or Johnny got that work permit for 3 years while Bobby is getting trained. And then Bobby's going to get a shot at this. If Bobby doesn't show up to work, that's a different thing.
Right.
Bobby should have the shot.
Right.
And that sort of matching isn't happening right now. And then for the businesses who then are good, what they call good corporate citizens, maybe they should get some free breaks. They brought jobs back into the country. They've hired Caymanians. This is how you'll incentivize them to bring home. Look, you've got 5 or 6 monetary authority licenses under your roof. You're employing 90 people. About 75% of them are Caymanian. We'll give you a break. You over there don't have any Caymanians here. Most of your businesses are overseas. You'll pay the full freight. And then if they look around and say, well, actually, if the cost of business is a little bit less expensive here,
bring them back.
Bring them back.
So you brought up something about understanding the lay of the land, and for the, well, I guess I'll use a bad term, the good hombres, for the people who might be playing a little bit in the gray area to black area. What do you feel about, I've seen the manifesto, you have enforcement. I specifically wanted to get into Regulation 6. For people that are listening that may not know, Regulation 6 is a training plan that you have for certain roles, where you highlight a Caymanian who will be the successor for that role, and the training plan outlines the strategy in getting that Caymanian trained, qualified, and experienced to assume that role. How do you envision improving enforcement with work and I guess strengthening Regulation 6?
So I think what I understand from the way the Department of Work is working, or trying to work, and there are good people in there. There are Caymanians in there who want to see it move forward. From listening to them, I think they feel as though the department is working at cross purposes. There's a unit within the department that is, I think, the former NWDA, where their job is to get Caymanians back to work. And there's another unit that's job is the production of work permits. And I think their budget and their outlook is based on how many work permits that they produce. So within the department, they're working at cross purposes. Before you get to the enforcement, because enforcement is already, the consequences already happened, let's get to prevention.
Okay.
So if now you turn back focus to say, look, the two of you have to have the same focus of getting Caymanians back to work with more data. My example from the last question. Provided that we are getting the Caymanians in the jobs and are matching and mining that data and they're moving up the ranks, you should have to have less enforcement. Some people then counter argue and say, Andre, but that could take a while. In the meantime, there's already strong laws on the books that people quite rightly say, Andre, you don't need any more laws. There are already laws and penalties now. You just have to give instructions to the boards to say, do it. Because I've sat on a board in the past, and I've been invited to a board in the past, and people say, well, nah, I don't know that we should go there because that so-and-so will call this politician and that person will come to the board. No. And I think every business should expect it. If you were there to be the referee to call balls and strikes, and there's a strike, do the enforcement.
Right.
That's it. Simple as that. There shouldn't be any kind of scratching of heads and this might offend this one or that person's going to chase me. Call the strike.
Okay.
And that's the only way the country's going to learn.
I 1,000% agree. I'll share it off air. PR system. There was one point in there that I wanted to ask about specifically. That was the rollover, the civil service, right? Because granted, it's been kind of I'm not saying everyone, but it's been kind of a thing where if you have a skill set as an expat or immigrant, and you may be approaching a rollover, you may be incentivized to look for a government job. But there are some very specific, specialized roles in government that are held by work permit. Well, they don't have work permits. Contracts. Mm-hmm. Is there any kind of idea around retaining them or giving special, exemptions towards them?
So I think what you should see in the manifesto from memory is a sort of a grandfathering in. So let's take where I believe you're going with the premise of the question. The majority of, say, teachers, the majority of, say, police officers, the majority of, say, social workers, maybe non-Caymanians. So if you were to implement a policy tomorrow, you could have a mass exodus in some of these essential services, and what does the country do? Whereas if you allow a grandfathering or a phasing in over time, the country then isn't put in a precarious position, and the policy can work over time. So I'll give credit where credit is due. I don't see any reason that it would have changed, but when I was in cabinet, I used to listen to a caucus. I used to listen to, and even spoke to him outside, the current police commissioner, who's on a drive, I think it was in the paper last week, who's on a drive to recruit more and more Caymanians into the police force so that you have more Caymanians, and I think he's also on a drive to have a diverse set of nationalities where you do need a non-Caymanian than one particular nationality. So I know there's a drive to that, but it's not going to happen overnight. So though there are examples for essential services where you'd have to have a phasing in.
And I was also kind of thinking of specialized roles such as maybe some surgeons,
doctors. That's another one.
Doctors, like scientists.
So you don't want to put the country in trouble.
Yeah.
If someone were to listen and this was a call and say, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? So let's maybe start there so that we keep the overall objective in mind.
Correct.
The problem you're trying to solve is because the non-Caymanian enter into the civil service does not go through the work permit system and is issued a contract under the legislation, like the Immigration Act, then the Caymanian then may feel that, hold on, that someone has left the private sector, got the job above me, and maybe was either an essential service or maybe a policy role, and because it's now outside of the work permit realm, can continue
to
working,
compete against me.
Not only compete against me, but continue to accumulate the years to get to PR and then become Caymanian. So if that occurs, then how will I ever, as the Caymanian, elevate to the job that was once held by a non-Caymanian? If you apply the rollover policy to the civil service, then the Caymanian has a greater degree of security, provided that they perform, that I will eventually be trained up to have the supervisory role. And that's the problem you're trying to solve.
Right.
So you don't want to put the country into deep peril from day one and have a hard rule where essential service workers are gone. And then people say, well, wait a second, there's no more police stuff. Well, who made this decision? We may not have been completely happy with them, but they were there. Now they're gone. But at the same time, the problem we're trying to solve is to make sure that the greatest chance of the elevation of Caymanians occurs and to limit what might turn into a loophole.
Okay. Just quickly, this question should be pretty quick. What categories of work permits do you feel should be made more difficult to obtain?
I think there are, one, we talked about the temporary work permit.
Yes.
Should be made more difficult. And then I think there are other jobs where you can see that a Caymanian, even with the slightest bit of training, should be able to do. Particularly if the wage is higher, which might turn into the minimum wage discussion. So whether it's I'm not trying to belittle the jobs, that's why I'm hesitating for a second, because they're good jobs. But whether it is the host or hostess of a restaurant, whether or not it's a bartender. And I've heard from some really good Caymanian bar owners say you also have to change the economics of the job to attract the Caymanians in terms of minimum wage and pension and stuff like that. But say those are resolved. Those jobs that require the least amount of training or polishing should go to Caymanians right away. So you shouldn't have unemployment in some of those areas because that's an easier one to move into. Some of the other areas that say it's required, it really is a blockchain company and they need somebody who's an expert in blockchain. That's not something, that skill set you can find right away. But the ones that should be more difficult are the ones where it's easier for a Caymanian to adjust to and be able to be successful in.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about housing. It's another one that's right up there with immigration, especially to our audience who is much younger. And one of our actual co-hosts, Keisha, is trying to get into that market and is experiencing some of the trials and tribulations of it. So you've mentioned bringing back the government guaranteed home assisted mortgage program. That's a mouthful. I had to make sure I wrote that down. I was like, I'm not going to remember that.
That's why everybody called the GG Ham.
The GG Ham. How do you see that working to help Caymanians get a piece of the land? Because
it already worked. So it had a history of working, that if it was zero down on the mortgage, then that boosted the chances of Caymanians being able to get the mortgage and be able to get onto the property ladder. So there are Caymanians my age now. I never availed myself of it, but I know Caymanian friends my age who availed themselves of it. And just that fact of zero down on the down payment allowed them to meet the mortgage calculation by the bank, get the mortgage going, and get onto the property ladder. But it also now, with the prices of housing today, but have to be coupled with a few other things, like the increase of the upper limit for first-time Caymanian buyers.
Because right now it's at what?
I think it's $550 now. I think
that's a starter home.
Right, right. So
can you imagine $500,000 for a starter home?
Yes, and there's places now which you would consider middle-class areas where the land itself might be $400,000.
Absolutely, yeah, 1,000%.
So we're not talking some of the other more high-end neighborhoods. You're talking about just what you would consider middle class. And then my idea around that was still whether or not, because you might never be able to pick the perfect number. So I try to do this in a way that doesn't confuse the audience. Say there are countries in which the tax for pick any kind of category of tax is $100. And under that, you don't pay. But if you're whatever the category is, whether it's income, whether it's property, your value is 110. You wouldn't pay the tax on the entire 110. You'd pay the difference between the 100 and the 110.
What's over it?
What's over it.
Right.
The stamp duty code is our tax code. So we don't have direct taxes. We have indirect taxes and we have fees. Why not do that for the first-time Caymanian buyer? So say we go in and we lift the limit to $850.
Okay.
But then there's a Caymanian that gets something that's $875.
Then they got to pay the full.
I'm a first-time Caymanian buyer, right? So let's take you and I. You walk in, you found something in the neighborhood that's $825. The limit's been raised in our perfect world.
Right.
Chris, happy for you, bro.
Thank you.
My house down the road that I found is $875. Andre, you got to pay the full freight. But I'm a first-time Caymanian buyer too,
and that's what it's at 5%.
Yeah. So wait a minute. So Chris found something $50,000 cheaper, and he's laughing like, "Yeah, bro, I got my stamp duty break. What happens to me?" Yes, the country would lose that overall revenue, but the objective of the policy is to get the first-time Caymanian buyer onto the property ladder, so they could then understand the government can never pick the perfect number. But if I only had to pay on the difference, most Caymanians, and I've seen live examples of this when I had to act as, say, Minister of Finance when the Premier was away, can make that work within their loan package if they had to pay the difference. And then their loan application could go forward. Because remember what they're competing against. They're competing against other people who might buy, who might have greater means than them, who are on the island, who might be hunting for property for PR purposes.
Right.
So these little things make the difference. And the property owner is going to sell with who comes with the check first. So you're also missing opportunities like that. I see it as a win. Yes, government doesn't get the full freight of stamp duty, in my example, on me rather than you, but they're going to get something. But the overall social policy has been met that the Caymanian has got onto the property ladder.
So you brought up the PR hopefuls buying properties in order to gain, I think it's the most amount of points out of any single thing, like 30 or 50, something like that. You want to either reduce it or remove that requirement? Remove it altogether.
Remove it.
So what would you replace that requirement with in the point system, or how do you like scale it to bring it to some kind of equilibrium?
Goes back to what was embedded in an answer 4 questions ago, is why not have them add sums of money to a new social development fund or a government strategic reserve fund, so when there is a rainy day and a global trade war, government has another pot of money that it can use. So rather than you buy a particular house to accumulate points, because it's just a math calculation, right,
Mm-hmm.
PR, let's take that factor out of the equation and make it that you have to put X amount of money into a social development fund. And hopefully you'd want that person to become more socially conscious on the island. And maybe even educate them as to where it would go.
Because they want to see that money spent wisely,
Well,
because it's their money.
It's their money. So then you begin, which is why we called it the Caymanian Community Party, because you're trying to get the country back to where it was a harmonious community. Because there are individuals now, I said this on a couple of media interviews before, that have come to Cayman 70s, 80s, 90s, and you don't even see them as non-Caymanian. You just see them as us because they assimilated with us.
1,000%.
They came with us. So you can think of at least a dozen individuals in your mind right now.
Half my schoolmates.
Yes, that are just like...
I never looked at them as anything else.
As anything else, because they were with you.
Yeah, man.
They assimilated with you. But now, because we've gotten larger and certain factors allow you to not have to assimilate if you don't want to, like the education school system is now segregated. If all you have to do is buy a piece of property, but you're not really investing in the community itself, then you may not know the community. So you're getting this separate system. So in my example, say we're in the building where Sunrise is now. And the future goal of Sunrise is not to be this interim spot, even though we move them out of West Bay into a proper office area in the center of town. But the future vision is that they would have their own facility for persons with disabilities who are also trying to integrate and live productive lives. Maybe you plunk down to a social development fund that's going to help fund that new facility. And then you begin to learn about it. And maybe you're actually asked to go and help somehow. Be on a board that's going to actually help Caymanians. Maybe you're part of donating your time to these training courses I've been talking about, whether it's tech companies for AI, blockchain, teaching Caymanians how to code. And then you'll see, you can see elements of it now. We just need to strengthen these areas. Like say one-to-one that used to call big brother, big sister. There are folks who are non-Caymanians who are really bonded with that young Caymanian mentee, but they're actually like almost like uncle and nephew.
Absolutely.
Aunt and niece, and vice versa. And then that person feels like this is now where we're functioning as a community. That's what you want to get to.
So a topic that I have some bias to because I can't stand some of the architectural design some of these buildings are doing, but that's my own bias. Other people may like them. Construction. How do you look at construction in Cayman? Some people are saying it is out of control. Some people are saying it is happening way too much. There's some nostalgic places that are going to be brought down for other condominiums to be put up. Naming one of them is, I forget the name of the plaza, but where Jungle is and Duke's is right now. That's to be torn down. And
that's in West Bay South.
That's where you are. Yeah. and the little coffee shop that's there is going to be gone, and a whole new 10-story condo complex is going up full of glass. That was a little bit biased. I shouldn't have said it like that. But.
So this goes back to the ongoing issue of a national development plan, where the rules of the road are set out as to where you can build, how you can do it, what type you can do, so everybody knows the framework that you're working with. The current tension between, say, environment and heritage, when you listen to those stakeholders, they'll come to caucus, you'll hear them out, and it's a legitimate point that their view is that planning is not planning the overall planning of the country of where we're going. Their planning is the transactional development to development and how it fits within the framework. On the other side of the coin, the planning ministry and its stakeholders feels it keeps bucking up against rules of where they can go, where they can't go, and it's slowing down business, and I need to be able to build. The purpose of the overall development plan, and there are good seeds of it that are out there now. I mentioned some in my West Bay South forum, is the Plan Cayman, where it takes into account different zones, where you can build, what you can build, what's preserved for heritage. So Chris and others believe that this area should be preserved. There's good reasons for that. That will then continue to have our heritage included in the Cayman landscape. How high you can go, for what income levels. So what the country is missing, and that also includes stormwater management in it, because you remove the catchment area for flooding in one area because you put a development, then somebody else floods, and you're having to do this jumping around exercise is happening now. Which is
why EIAs are important.
EIAs are important, right? Because these things need to be spotted. You need a storm water management plan. But then that goes back into this, even though Plan Cayman is a good start, it also goes into the piece of work that I think the country is yearning for, is where are we going as an overall country? Because the physical built environment is only one aspect of it. Where do we want to take Cayman for, say, 2035?
That's one of the most difficult parts for me.
It is.
Because it's like, I truly believe that, a wise man, I won't mention his name, but, he's like, son, everybody wants to get to a certain destination, but we all gonna row about how we get there.
Mm-hmm.
So we all have different versions of how we see the future. We want a good future for Cayman. I doubt that you can say that nobody wants that. But how we see ourselves getting there, I think, is the most difficult part to agree upon, right? So I don't envy the task that you have in front of you of getting agreements upon how that looks, right? I have my own bias. Like I see, like myself alone, I have my own bias. I'm like, I hate the glass. I hate these big glass structures. I'm walking to Seven Mile Beach, right? And I see some of like the older buildings that were built back in like the 80s, 90s, those condos that are like 3-story that, they just look charming, amazing. They look welcoming. And then for me personally, I'm not speaking on you or anybody else, me personally, you got these structures that look a little bit cold, unwelcoming. Just, it's my personal feeling. But anyway, I guess the development plan, as you said, would help with that.
I think I would try to boil it down as simply as you could, which is ultimately you want Cayman to be stronger. You want it to be fair for all Caymanians. Those who are in the minority, like say those with persons with disabilities. You want to preserve the culture. You want Caymanians to come home and be a part of the economy. You want older persons to be able to retire in dignity. If you just keep those sort of basic themes in mind, I think folks can live with the fact that there may be a zone that's dedicated to a particular business. If it's tech, if it's tourism, there's a zone that you can be proud of that's going to be dedicated to heritage, to preservation.
Before we get out of here, I wanted to get my phone to ask a couple of questions. I'll probably do 2 or 3. I'm sorry, but let me just grab it and
take your time.
What kind of deal is it government has with CUC that no government-owned property has been installed with solar panels to help aid financial costs on government?
I don't have that information being outside of cabinet right now. I don't have that information.
Okay. If elected, what will Andre do differently to prevent ministers from abusing their power or benefiting from insider connections? Not exactly sure what that's in reference to, but
the first thing is that you're with a team that you can trust, that have signed up to a party constitution, a party code of conduct, which we plan to put in place, and then Parliament needs to adopt a parliamentary code of conduct, which was already signed by most of the 2021 administration. You'll have to ask the PPM why they didn't sign, and it wasn't adopted. And then, if it's breached, enforce it.
Okay, this one. Ask Andre why the TCCP chose to bring Mr. Panton on board, and who is the deputy leader of the party?
So the deputy leader of the party under the Constitution will be a decision of the party leader. At the moment, instead of focusing on that, we focused on trying as much as we can to complete the mission of winning the election and winning as much seats as we can, hopefully all of us. In the meantime, as it relates to Minister Panton, he shares the vision of the party. He shares the values of the party. He's a competent minister. He has international and both local experience. He fits with the overall vision that we have of where we want to take the country. He's a complement.
The debate so far posed questions on the economic and social well-being of Cayman. However, have not, to my knowledge, to the readers, to the questions, not my knowledge, but to the person's knowledge, pose any questions on the social divide in our country communities, primarily between white Caymanian families and black Caymanian families, and those in between, respectively, the inequality between ourselves as Caymanians, not just expatriate community, and foreign nationals we welcome to our country over the decades. So I think they want to know about the divide amongst ourselves.
So if the person posing the question, the author of the question, goes back to the West Bay South Forum. They should see in the opening question of what the three priorities are, where I set out what the party would like to get done. And now, if you look into the manifesto, there are about 10 objectives in cost of living. We talked about them: cost of living, housing, education, workforce development, having that human capital plan. We talked about access to housing. How I frame the answer to that question is, to my mind, those are all priorities, but they're all a means to an end to resolve what I believe is the central challenge of our time, which is to narrow the gap between the wealthy and the not so wealthy and the struggling. That is the central challenge, in my view, of our time. And those items that are in the manifesto that keep coming up on each debate is how you're going to address it to narrow the playing field. Because what is happening now, which is what the person is raising, is continuing to see a fracturing of Cayman rather than what's in the name of a Caymanian community. We need to get to a state, and this is the future vision of the party, to ensure that all Caymanians, as much as possible, to the fullest extent possible, are participating and benefiting from the success that's coming to the country. We do that, and going back and connecting that to what you and I talked about as the overall vision and plan for the country and what you're trying to achieve, we do that, the country not only comes together, I hand on heart believe it reaches heights that benefit all that we haven't seen yet. If I think of, in my travels as financial services minister and looking at other countries, I still, for the most part, would not trade our problems for theirs. So as much as we have our challenges and our struggles, and we have them, we're still much better in a much better position. But if we can connect these dots, we can resolve what that author of the question is seeing, because then we're all moving to the same drumbeat, which is what you and I were talking about, Caymanians back in the day that you've come up with, that didn't come here as Caymanian. But now you don't see them any differently because they're with us.
1,000%. The young lady had another question about forming the party and stuff, but I'm pretty sure that we went into quite good detail about your reason for forming the party, and why you chose the people that you did. So with that, thank you for all the listeners that did contribute to the Q&A part of that. I appreciate you all. If I missed anyone, I am sorry. I did my best there. But we have definitely taken out quite a bit of Mr. Ebanks' time. I appreciate you for going overtime with us today. But I think it's very important that the people actually get to hear from the leaders of the parties. I think that the leaders set the tone for the rest of the group, and answering the questions that the people really need to hear before they get to the polls on April 30th. So I guess before we get out of here, if you want to have any parting words of how people can find you, and I guess why they should be voting TCCP come April 30th.
So maybe a couple of points. One is, and I don't know that it has gotten as much, I think, attention as it deserves, where we had a tragic fatality of Judy Ann Miles, fatality in her car, on brutal. Mm-hmm. I want to say that whatever the police investigation uncovers, we need to have that make sense, and whatever happened, rectify it so it doesn't happen to someone again, to make her tragedy matter. Right. Whatever type of circumstances led to that, we need to address. This is someone that I traveled with as minister, that I knew was a hard-working public servant, intelligent, the type of Caymanian that you could see going to the top of her organization, or at least having a shot of it in the future. To to have that level of tragedy, I don't want it to where we get to the point. I'm not suggesting this is happening. I don't want it to happen. That we get to the point where we are desensitized to this, and it's just the next news event. This requires pause, study, reflection, and whatever occurred there, put whatever means possible for that not to happen again to anybody. But particularly it hits you hard when you know this is somebody you rub shoulders with, you travel to defend the country with in Brussels and in Paris and these places. Singapore, I think her and I were in Singapore together. We were in Paris together. Bled Cayman.
You knew her well.
Knew her well. So those of us who knew her well, complete shout out to the Monetary Authority. I can't imagine what they're feeling inside those walls. So that's number one. I wanted to actually put some focus.
Rest her soul, thoughts and prayers.
Focus on that for her family and thoughts and prayers at that time, and to figure out what happened and have some sort of redress so it doesn't happen to someone again. In terms of, so thank you for that airtime for that.
Yeah.
In terms of wrapping up.
Absolutely.
In the manifesto, I think the phrase that we use is a pivotal intersection. I can remember my dad helping candidates in the past, in the 2000s, earlier than that when I was younger. And I remember at each time it was like, we can't let this election get away. We can't let this election, we can't let them get away with this one. And maybe that is said at every election. But it truly feels, for the variety of factors of where the country is headed, some of which was alluded to by the author of that longer question, really does feel that we need to get this one right. So if you want to have the more transformative changes happen that is going to make Cayman stronger, make it fairer, move into the modern age where necessary, get Caymanians to participate and benefit from the success that's coming to the country. Ignore the negative rhetoric that's part of campaigning. I can see it taking a turn to negative town more and more as we get to the run-up of 30 April. Keep in mind the facts. Do your due diligence, but know that there is a hope and a vision for that more modern, transparent Cayman where everybody benefits. And that is the mission of the Caymanian Community Party, to bring us back into focus and into balance, where the many benefit rather than the select few. If that is where you would ultimately like the country to go, folks can come back home, get onto the property ladder, have good jobs, people can retire in dignity. Then vote for the Caymanian Community Party. Vote for a new approach to governance where you don't back down from particular special interests or side deals that stymie things that we all know is blindingly obvious that need to occur. Vote for the Caymanian Community Party on the 30th of April to take us into our next successful era. God bless you all, and happy Easter.
Where can people find you before you go?
People can find me at votetccp.ky.
All right, and all the information
All
will
the
be
information is there.
Excellent.
And the manifesto is there, and that has all of the digits and the pictures and the bios.
Mr. Ebanks, it has been a pleasure. This has been a wonderful conversation. I thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it, my guy.
Thank you, brother.
So whether you are driving to work, from work, at work, doing work, not doing work, listening at home with your kids, without kids, with your dog, cat, mouse, or Hickory, I appreciate you all listening. This has been the LinkUp before the ballad. We've had Andre Ebanks with us. Until next time.